My name is Julia Dydak, and I'm a senior political science student here at Bloomsburg University. I chose to do my project on women's rights in Iran, despite the fact that Iran is not a Pacific Asian country, because the matter is so pressing in the current media due to the historic protests taking place. Starting around the 1920s, women were not in such a bad place in terms of equality. Under the rule of the first Shah of Iran, Reza Shah Pahlavi and his son Mohammad Reza, liberalization took place. Women were constantly gaining rights such as access to free education, and women could now attend universities along with their male counterparts. Women's rights organizations sprung up all over, fighting for more rights for women. Eventually, women were even granted the right to vote and to run for parliament in 1936. The Iranian Women's Party emerged in 1942, and women were now able to divorce and have custody of their children from the family protection law. The minimum age of marriage was raised from 13 to 18 years old, and women became a huge part of the workforce and were serving in hundreds of local governmental positions. Women were free to go on picnics, wear Western-style clothes, and show off their jewelry and makeup as well as their hair. The future looked bright and promising, and activists continued to push for more and more. This all changed during the Revolution of 1979. Decades of rights that were gained were now being stripped from women by the new theocracy under Ayatollah Khomeini. They took away all of these family protections that women gained. Men could now just choose to divorce their wives whenever they pleased and took the children uncontested. They also imposed strict Islamic laws and dress codes. Women used to wear things such as miniskirts and tight jeans, but now they all have to wear the hijab despite their religion, even little girls. They even approved a law in 1981 called the Islamic Law of Retribution, which allowed for beating and torturing people who committed crimes from adultery to violating the Islamic dress code. This was an obvious target at women. They could even be lashed up to 70 times for any bit of their hair showing. The age of marriage was reduced even lower to 9 years old. Women were pushed out of their governmental positions but were said to still have the right to vote. In reality, this was not true. Through all of this, women continued to fight hard to gain their rights back. They even made some progress by getting the age of marriage raised back up to 13, and some women getting back into schools and governmental positions. Despite these efforts, they still faced a world of discrimination and hatred. Women were barred from becoming the supreme leader of the country, and although it was never said that they could not run for president, they were always disqualified when they tried. Men are light years ahead of women in terms of legal and social authority. They did not do anything about the sexual abuse and violence that women face, and they even punished them for speaking out about it. Women were completely suppressed by violence and could not make one wrong move without facing torture and death. But once again, the women of Iran never gave up. The Iran-Iraq War in 1980 to 1988 brought women back to the forefront. They became doctors and nurses and took up jobs on the war front. Some took over the household while their husbands were at war, and others became part of the war, carrying guns and going on missions. Women came out and voted overwhelmingly for Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani in 1989 and 1993. He was much more lenient on women and rolled back some of the major social controls that women faced. Women were facing less pointless harassment and were able to play in sports competitions and begin to attend school in droves. He reversed the idea that Iranians should have large families due to the alarming population growth rate, and he brought the annual population growth increase down to 1.8% by the end of his rule, as you can see on the chart to the left. Beginning in 1997, women gained even more wins through Mohammad Khatami. He appointed women to important positions, including VP of the Environment, and even elected 13 women to Parliament. He began to reintroduce family protection laws, put women judges on courts, and allow for women to get payment following no-fault divorces by their husbands. Women could now study abroad, and women's rights organizations flourished once again. The next president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, of 2005, was faced with a time of crazy pushback between hardliners and revolutionaries. The reign began with women losing their few regained rights once again. The government crushed feminist newspapers, elected fewer women than they had in years, and police got even stricter on dress code violations. Women were commanded to have more children. However, during the 2009 presidential election, women showed up. They strongly supported two reformist candidates that supported expanding women's rights. Women began to campaign and advise candidates in this election, which was the first time in history. The president remained silent on women's issues. He lost a ton of support as he did not speak out about the increasing harshness and violence being pushed on women by his regime. He tried to build the bridges back by nominating 3 women to be on his cabinet. However, only one was actually approved and was quickly dismissed by Ahmadinejad himself. Any ounce of support for women that he claimed he had was all for show, as women were now even being banned from tons of fields of study by universities. In 2013 came Hassan Rouhani. He did not follow up on his campaign promises to elect women to his cabinet or to allow for the Ministry of Women's Affairs to exist. He knew that if he did so, this was not going to go over so well with the majority of the parliament being conservative. Despite this, he went on to appoint 4 women as vice presidents and 3 women as governors, which was the first time in history. Yet he still faced the challenge of the conservative parliament. Women's rights activists upped the ante in 2016. They worked hard to attempt to get a majority that valued women's equality. In terms of social status, Rouhani was able to reel in some of the discrimination against women. He asked the police to enforce the law and not just Islamic violations, and women started feeling more comfortable wearing flashy outfits and makeup. Women broke back into the fashion industry and even started their own brands and companies. But in terms of politics, he could not gain the same control. He attempted to get women activists out of prison, but the judiciary and other security organizations continued to throw them in jail. He did not alter any of the family law, and the age for marriage is still 13 to this day. Women have to get permission from the men in their lives for everything, including to travel. A law was even passed allowing men to marry their young adopted daughters, and women were barred from being waitresses in cafes. They have to work in the back, out of sight of everyone else. The women of this country continue to be unstoppable in spirit despite how brutally their government treats them. They have never stopped fighting for their lives, even as their sisters, mothers, and friends are killed around them. The most recent stage of activism erupted following the death of Mahsa Amini while in custody of the morality police. Her family said there was bruising on her body and blamed the police for beating her to death due to inappropriate clothing. The people of Iran did not take lightly to this. They began to protest loudly, publicly, and en masse. Women began removing their headscarves and cutting their hair in public to show solidarity. Male students made human shields to guide girls into their schools. The government immediately hit back by taking away citizens' access to social media and communication apps. Protesters and prisoners are being killed at an alarming rate, including over 66 people at just one protest. Security forces are firing machine guns at peaceful protesters and even killing children. Due to Amini being seen as just a regular young girl who was snatched from her family, people of all classes, groups, and political aisles are uniting in their outrage unlike ever before. Over 14,000 protesters have been arrested, beaten, and tortured. Iran is facing outrage from around the world. The former president of FIFA is calling for Iran to be barred from the World Cup. Multiple countries are placing sanctions on Iran, and people from all different places are showing their support and protests online. Human rights activists say that the death toll now reaches over 300 people dead. One policy analyst says that it's hard to tell at this point if this will turn into a full-blown civil war, and that the government still probably thinks that they can slowly phase this out. However, when all majority of the women of Iran are standing up in full force for change, men will begin to join them, and when enough men rise up in support of the women, the regime will have a much harder time squashing a revolution. Political scientists are also saying that the regime being so alarmed and affected by these protests shows that they are working and that they see them as a legitimate threat. These are some images of the protests that are currently going on in Iran. There are images of women cutting their hair, removing their hijab, burning their hijab, and holding up signs of Amini.